Comment where you're watching from today. In the heart of rural Ohio, where cornfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon and time seemed to move a little slower, Beverly Davis's weathered hands trembled as she held the foreclosure notice. 60 years of memories, joy, and heartache were contained within these 100 acres, and now, at 73, she was about to lose it all. The bank had given her 30 days. 30 days to say goodbye to the only home she'd ever known. The farm had been her sanctuary since the day she married William Davis in 1965. Together, they had transformed the struggling plot into one of the most prosperous farms in the county. But 3 years ago, when William's heart gave out during the spring planting, everything changed. The medical bills had piled up, and the drought that followed seemed like nature itself was conspiring against her. Beverly stood on her front porch, the same porch where she and William had spent countless evenings watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The white paint was peeling now, much like her grip on this piece of American dream. The bank's latest letter had been clear. They weren't interested in another extension. The modern world had no patience for sentiment, no room for the old ways. The local news had gotten wind of her story. Last of the family farms falls to corporate interest, they'd said. Beverly hadn't wanted the attention, but her grandson had insisted on sharing their story. Sometimes, he'd said, the right person needs to hear about the wrong thing. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. The morning air was crisp as Beverly walked the perimeter of her property, something she'd done every day since William's passing. The autumn wind whispered through the cornfields, carrying with it the echoes of happier times. She remembered the day they'd bought this land, young, scared, but full of dreams. William had stood right there by the old oak tree and promised her they'd build something lasting. They'd kept that promise for over 5 decades. The Davis farm had become known throughout the county for its sweet corn and the best tomatoes anyone had ever tasted. Beverly and William had raised 3 children here, watched them learn to walk on these very fields, taught them the value of hard work and perseverance. Now their grandchildren played in the same barn where their parents had once hidden during games of hide and seek. But the world had changed. The small family farms were disappearing one by one, swallowed up by large agricultural corporations that cared more about profit margins than the stories etched into the land. Beverly had watched as her neighbors, one after another, had been forced to sell. The Thompsons last year, the Hendersons the year before that. Each sale felt like a personal loss, another piece of their community's soul chipped away. She made her way back to the house, her joints protesting every step. The kitchen calendar hung accusingly on the wall, each passing day marked with a thick black X. 26 days left. The bank had been clear. Either she came up with the money to cover the outstanding payments and refinance the loan, or they would proceed with the foreclosure. Beverly had tried everything. She'd called every bank in 3 counties, reached out to agricultural cooperatives, even considered selling part of the land to save the rest. But no one was interested in helping a widow with mounting debts keep a failing farm afloat. The numbers didn't add up, they said. In today's economy, small farms like hers were no longer viable. Her daughter Sarah had offered to help, but Beverly couldn't accept. Sarah had her own family to think about, her own children's college funds to consider. The farm's troubles were Beverly's burden to bear, even if it meant losing everything she and William had built together. As she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photos of 3 generations that had called this land home, a black SUV turned onto her gravel driveway. Her heart sank. She wasn't expecting the bank representatives until next week. Through her screen door, she watched a tall figure emerge from the vehicle. It wasn't the usual bank representative Thomas Pierce with his crisp suit and rehearsed sympathy. The man approaching her door moved with purpose, but without the predatory stride she'd come to associate with bank officials. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, looking more like he belonged in these parts than in a downtown office. As he drew closer, Beverly recognized him from television and newspapers. J.D. Vance, the author and politician who'd written about growing up in communities just like hers. Beverly quickly wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of the flour from her morning baking still dusting her fingers. She hadn't expected visitors, let alone someone like him. The screen door creaked as she opened it, a sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Mrs. Davis. His voice was gentler than she'd expected, carrying none of the polished political tone she'd heard in his speeches. "I'm J.D. Vance. I read about your situation in the paper, and I'd like to talk with you if you have a moment." Beverly nodded, opening the door wider. "I just made some fresh coffee," she said, falling back on the hospitality that had been ingrained in her since childhood. "Would you care for a cup?" As they sat at her worn kitchen table, Beverly couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked among her faded curtains and well-used appliances. Yet there was something in his eyes that spoke of understanding, of knowing what it meant to see a way of life slipping away. "Your farm has been in the family for quite some time," he began, accepting the steaming cup she offered. It wasn't a question, but Beverly answered anyway. "William, my husband, and I bought it in '65, she said, her voice catching slightly. "On his name. Back then, everyone said we were crazy. The soil was poor, the equipment was ancient, and the previous owner had let everything go to seed. But William," she smiled at the memory, "William saw potential where others saw problems." She told him about those early years, about the back-breaking work of bringing the land back to life, how they'd lived on hope and determination more than money, how the community had rallied around them, helping with harvests, sharing equipment, watching each other's children. It was a way of life that was disappearing faster than the morning dew under a summer sun. "The bank says the numbers don't work anymore," Beverly continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "They talk about economies of scale and profit margins. But how do you put a number on 60 years of memories? How do you quantify the value of knowing every inch of your land, of watching your grandchildren play in the same fields where their parents grew up?" J.D. Vance listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the farm's operations, the crops they grew, the challenges they faced. His questions were specific, knowledgeable, not the superficial queries of a politician looking for a voto opportunity. "Mrs. Davis," he said finally, setting down his empty cup, "I didn't come here today just to hear your story, though I'm grateful you shared it with me. I came because I believe farms like yours are worth saving, not just for the food they produce, but for what they represent. The values, the work ethic, the sense of community they foster." Beverly felt her throat tighten. She'd heard similar words before, usually followed by explanations of why nothing could be done to help. "The world's changing," she acknowledged, "and maybe there isn't room anymore for farms like ours." "The world is always changing," Vance replied, "but that doesn't mean we have to lose what matters most. Sometimes we just need to find new ways to preserve the old values." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've been looking into your situation, Mrs. Davis. The bank's assessment of your property, the loan terms, the current market conditions, and I think there might be a way forward." For the next hour, they discussed possibilities Beverly hadn't known existed, programs designed to protect family farms, agricultural trusts, cooperative arrangements that could help reduce costs while maintaining individual ownership. Vance explained each option clearly, pointing out both benefits and potential challenges. "It won't be easy," he cautioned, "and it will require some changes in how the farm operates. But if you're willing to adapt while holding on to what matters most, I believe we can find a way to keep this land in your family." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her kitchen floor, Beverly felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate kind that had sustained her through sleepless nights, but something more substantial, built on practical possibilities, rather than mere wishes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "Surely there are bigger problems demanding your attention." Vance was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the family photos on her wall. "When I wrote Hillbilly Elegy," he said finally, "I wasn't just telling my family's story. I was writing about a way of life that's worth preserving. Places like your farm, people like you and your late husband, you're the backbone of this country. When we lose farms like yours, we lose more than just agricultural production. We lose our connection to the land, to our values, to each other." He stood up, gathering his papers. "I can't promise miracles, Mrs. Davis, but I can promise that you won't have to face this alone anymore. Will you let me help?" Beverly looked around her kitchen, at the walls that had witnessed so many family gatherings, at the window through which she could see the fields William had loved so much. She thought about all the people who had sat at this very table over the years. Neighbors sharing coffee after a long day of helping with the harvest, children doing homework while she prepared dinner, grandchildren sneaking cookies when they thought she wasn't looking. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Yes, I would appreciate your help." As she watched J.D. Vance's SUV disappear down her driveway, Beverly felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd been carrying hadn't disappeared, but it felt more manageable somehow. She walked out onto her porch, breathing in the familiar scents of her land, rich soil, growing things, and the promise of tomorrow. The sun was setting. Now, painting the sky in those brilliant colors she and William had loved so much. She could almost hear his voice, telling her to keep fighting, to never give up on their dream. For the first time in months, Beverly Davis smiled, knowing that while the path ahead might be different from what she'd imagined, it didn't have to end here. The story of the Davis farm wasn't over yet. It was just beginning a new chapter. Vishu. Morning after J.D. Vance's visit, Beverly Davis woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 60 years. But today felt different. The weight of impending loss that had become her constant companion had lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious flutter of hope. She moved through her morning routine with renewed purpose, pausing only briefly at the kitchen window to watch the sun paint the horizon in shades of promise. News of Vance's visit had spread through the community like wildfire. In a small farming town, word traveled faster than the seasonal winds that swept across the cornfields. By mid-morning, Beverly's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Neighbors, friends, and even people she barely knew called to offer support, share their own stories, or simply express their hope that something good might finally be happening for one of their own. Chad Lamb, whose family farm bordered the Davis property to the north, was the first to show up at her door. "Heard J.D. Vance was here yesterday," he said, standing on her porch with a fresh pie from his wife. "About time somebody in power took notice of what's happening to folks like us." Beverly invited him in, noting how his weathered face carried the same lines of worry she'd seen in her mirror. The Lambs were facing their own struggles, though they hadn't reached the critical point that the Davis farm had yet. He talked about forming cooperatives, Beverly explained, serving coffee in the same cups she'd used with Vance the day before. Said there might be a way for small farms to work together, share resources, reduce costs while keeping our independence. Chad's eyes lit up with interest. "You know, my grandfather used to talk about something similar back in the 40s. Farmers around here would share equipment, help each other with harvests. Nobody had enough money to do everything alone, but together." He trailed off, lost in thought. The conversation was interrupted by another arrival. Lisa Wallace, whose family had sold their farm to corporate interests 2 years ago, stepped into Beverly's kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. "I saw the news about Vance's visit. Beverly, You have to fight. What happened to our place can't happen here. This farm, it's more than just land, it's history. It's family, it's everything our community stands for. As the morning wore on, more neighbors arrived. Beverly's kitchen, which had felt so empty since William's passing, was now filled with voices, ideas, and a growing sense of purpose. Paul Hansen, who ran the local agricultural supply store, brought documents showing how corporate farming had affected small businesses in the area. Eric Carrillo, a second-generation farmer who had modernized his family's operation, offered insights into new farming technologies that could help reduce costs. Around noon, Beverly's phone rang again. It was J.D. Vance. "Mrs. Davis," his voice carried a note of excitement. "I've been making some calls. There's a meeting of the Agricultural Committee next week. I'd like you to speak. Tell your story. Help them understand what's really at stake here." Beverly's hand tightened on the receiver. Public speaking had never been her strong suit. That had been William's domain. He had been the one to stand up at community meetings, to argue with bank representatives, to make their case to anyone who would listen. I don't know if I can," she began, but Vance interrupted gently. "Mrs. Davis, your story is powerful because it's real. You're not just fighting for your farm. You're fighting for a way of life that's disappearing across this country. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell the truth." As she looked around her kitchen at the faces of her neighbors, Beverly felt something stir inside her. These people had come together today, not just for her, but for what her struggle represented. Each of them had their own story, their own battles with banks and corporations, their own fears about the future of their way of life. "When is the meeting?" she asked, her voice stronger now. The news energized the group in her kitchen. Michael Washington, who taught agriculture at the local high school, offered to help her prepare her testimony. "We need to show them the numbers," he said, pulling out a notebook. "Not just what these farms mean in terms of food production, but their impact on local economies, education, community stability." Jennifer Bell, whose family had farmed in the county for 4 generations, spoke, up from where she sat by the window. "We should talk about the environmental impact too. These corporate farms, they don't care about soil conservation or water quality. They're not thinking about the land's future because they're not planning to be here for that future." As the afternoon progressed, Beverly's testimony began to take shape. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of every small farmer who had ever watched their dream threatened by forces beyond their control. It was the story of communities fighting to preserve not just their livelihoods, but their very identity. Around sunset, as her impromptu war council was breaking up, Beverly walked out onto her porch with Chad Lamb. The evening air was heavy with the promise of rain, and in the distance, lightning flickered across the darkening sky. "You know," Chad said, his voice thoughtful, "when my daddy was alive, he used to say that farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was about growing community. Watching all these folks come together today, I think he was right." Beverly nodded, remembering similar words from William. "The question is, can we save it, this way of life we've all built together?" "Maybe that's not the right question," Chad replied. "Maybe the question is, how do we adapt it? How do we take what's best about our way of life and make it work in today's world?" Later that night, as Beverly sat at her kitchen table reviewing the notes from the day's discussions, she found herself looking at the old family photos on her wall differently. She had always seen them as memories of the past, but now they felt like guideposts to the future. The values they represented, hard work, community, perseverance, weren't outdated. They just needed to be applied in new ways. She picked up her phone and dialed her grandson's number. "Tommy, remember how you've been trying to convince me to let you set up that website for the farm? Tell me more about that idea." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Beverly's kitchen became command central for what was quickly becoming a movement larger than just saving one farm. Farmers from neighboring counties began calling, sharing their own stories, offering support, asking how they could get involved. J.D. Vance called daily with updates and suggestions. He had been working with agricultural experts and legal advisors, developing a comprehensive plan that could serve as a model for preserving family farms across the state. The Davis farm would be the test case, but the implications could reach far beyond one piece of land in rural Ohio. 6 days after Vance's initial visit, Beverly stood in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing the speech she would give to the Agricultural Committee. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she spoke the words she and her neighbors had crafted together. "My name is Beverly Davis," she began, meeting her own eyes in the mirror. "For 60 years, my husband and I worked this land, not just to make a living, but to build a legacy. Today, I'm here to talk to you about more than just saving one farm. I'm here to talk about saving the heart of America." The lightning she had seen the evening before had indeed brought rain, and now the morning sun sparkled on wet leaves and freshly washed fields. As Beverly walked out to her truck, she paused to look back at the farmhouse. William would have been proud, she thought, not just of her fighting to save their land, but of how the community had rallied together. This wasn't just about preserving the past anymore. It was about building a bridge to the future, finding a way to keep the best of their traditions while embracing the changes necessary for survival. The Davis farm might have started this fight alone, but it wouldn't be finishing it that way. As she drove toward the state capitol, Beverly thought about all the people who were counting on her today. Her neighbors, her family, farmers across the state who were watching to see if there might be hope for their own struggles. The pressure was enormous, but so was the support behind her. The future of the Davis farm, and perhaps many others like it, would depend on what happened in the next few hours. But for the first time since receiving that foreclosure notice, Beverly felt truly ready for the fight ahead. She wasn't just William Davis's widow anymore. She was the voice of a community determined to preserve its way of life, and she had something important to say. The marble halls of the state capitol building felt a world away from the familiar comfort of Beverly's farmhouse. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors as she followed J.D. Vance through the corridors, clutching her prepared testimony like a lifeline. The pearls her daughter Sarah had insisted she wear felt foreign against her neck, a costume piece in what felt increasingly like a performance she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "Remember," Vance said, pausing before the committee room, "Doors, you're not just telling your story. You're speaking for thousands of family farmers across the state. Just talk to them like you talked to the folks in your kitchen last week." Beverly nodded, though her throat felt dry. Through the doors, she could see the packed chamber. News of her testimony had spread, drawing not just committee members, but reporters, agricultural advocates, and other farmers from across the state. In the front row, she spotted Chad Lamb and several of her neighbors who had made the journey. To show their support, the committee chairman, Andrew Pierce, called the session to order. His voice carried the polished tone of career politicians, but his eyes showed genuine interest as he introduced Beverly. "Today we have a special witness, Mrs. Beverly Davis, who will speak about the crisis facing our family farms." As Beverly made her way to the podium, she caught a glimpse of Thomas Pierce, the bank representative, sitting in the back of the room with several other men in expensive suits. Their presence made her hands tremble slightly as she arranged her notes, but then she remembered William's words from so long ago. "The truth stands up straight and tall, Bev. No need to dress it up fancy." "Good morning," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Beverly Davis, and for 60 years my husband William and I worked our 100 acres in Harrison County. We raised 3 children there, grew crops that fed this state, and helped build a community that embodies the values we all hold dear. As she spoke, Beverly set aside her prepared notes. The words she needed weren't on those pages. They were written in the calluses on her hands, in the worry lines around her eyes, in the memories of 60 years lived in partnership with the land. When people talk about family farms today, they talk about numbers, profit margins, economies of scale. But let me tell you what those sterile terms don't capture. They don't tell you about the night our neighbor Eric Carrillo's barn burned down and how within hours half the county had showed up to help. They don't tell you about how our children learned mathematics by calculating seed quantities and crop yields, or how they learned responsibility by caring for animals and understanding that the work always needs doing, whether you feel like it or not. She paused, making eye contact with various committee members. They certainly don't tell you about the environmental stewardship that comes from knowing every inch of your land, from understanding that what you do this season affects not just next year's crops, but the legacy you leave for your grandchildren. For the next 30 minutes, Beverly painted a picture of what was at stake. She talked about the interconnected web of local businesses that depended on family farms, the role these farms played in food security, and the irreplaceable knowledge that was being lost as family farms disappeared. "But I'm not here just to tell you what we're losing," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm here to tell you what we could save, what we could build, if we're willing to adapt while holding on to what matters most." She outlined the cooperative model that she and her neighbors had been discussing, explaining how modern technology could be integrated with traditional farming wisdom. She talked about the potential for small farms to serve growing markets for organic and locally sourced foods, and how their intimate knowledge of their land could make them more efficient than large corporate operations. "The choice before us isn't between progress and tradition," she said, echoing Vance's words from their first meeting. "It's about finding a way to bring the best of our agricultural heritage into the future." As she spoke, Beverly noticed a change in the room. The committee members who had been checking their phones or shuffling papers were now leaning forward, engaged. Even Thomas Pierce had stopped whispering to his colleagues and was listening intently. When she finished speaking, the chamber was silent for a moment before Chairman Pierce cleared his throat. "Mrs. Davis, thank you for that powerful testimony. I have some questions, if you don't mind." What followed was 2 hours of detailed discussion. Committee members asked about specific challenges facing small farms, about the potential for cooperative arrangements, about the role of technology in modern farming. Beverly answered each question honestly, drawing not just from her own experience, but from the collective wisdom of her community. J.D. Vance occasionally interjected with technical details or policy proposals, but mostly he let Beverly speak for herself. She found herself growing more confident with each question, realizing that her lifetime of practical experience gave her insights that many of these policymakers lacked. The turning point came when Thomas Pierce raised his hand to speak. "Mrs. Davis," he began, his tone professionally neutral, "while your story is compelling, the fact remains that small farms like yours are simply not economically viable in today's market. How do you respond to that?" Beverly met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Pierce, 3 years ago when my husband passed away, you told me that numbers don't lie. Well, you were right, but maybe we've been looking at the wrong numbers." She pulled out a set of figures that Michael Washington had helped her prepare. These numbers show the true cost of corporate farming, the environmental impact, the drain on local economies, the loss of agricultural diversity. They show the hidden benefits of small farms, from soil conservation to community stability. When you account for all these factors, the equation looks very different. The chairman leaned forward. "Mrs. Davis, are you suggesting that our current metrics for agricultural success are incomplete?" "I'm suggesting, sir, that we can't measure the health of American agriculture purely in terms of quarterly profits. We need to think about long-term sustainability, about food security, about maintaining the knowledge and skills that have been passed down through generations. As the session concluded, Beverly felt drained but hopeful. The committee members were talking animatedly among themselves, and several had approached Vance to discuss specific policy proposals. But it was the conversation she overheard between two corporate representatives that gave her the most hope. "We might need to rethink our approach," one was saying to the other. "The public relations nightmare alone if we push forward with these foreclosures." Outside the Capitol building, her neighbors gathered around her, offering congratulations and support. Chad Lamb's eyes were suspiciously bright as he shook her hand. "William would have been proud, Beverly. Hell, we're all proud." J.D. Vance joined them, his expression thoughtful. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The committee was impressed, but more importantly, you've started a conversation that's been needed for a long time. There's going to be pushback, but I think we've got a real chance at making some changes." As they walked to their cars, Beverly looked up at the Capitol dome, gleaming in the afternoon sun. She thought about William, about their early days on the farm, about all the challenges they'd faced together. "You know," she said to no one in particular, "William used to say that farming is an act of faith. You plant seeds in the spring and trust that they'll grow. Maybe what we did today was plant a different kind of seed." The sun was setting by the time Beverly turned onto the familiar gravel road leading to her farm. The evening light gilded the cornfields, making them glow like something precious. And maybe they were, not just her fields, but all the family farms that might now have a fighting chance. As she parked in front of her house, Beverly noticed something unusual. There were cars parked along the road, dozens of them, and her porch lights were on, though she was sure she'd turned them off before leaving. Walking up to her front door, she could hear voices inside, smell food cooking. She opened the door to find her kitchen filled with neighbors, friends, and family. A hand-painted banner hung across the room. "Our voice was heard." Sarah rushed forward to hug her mother. "We saw you on the news, Mom. You were amazing." Her grandson Tommy was busy showing everyone the website he'd created for the farm, already filled with messages of support from across the state. Beverly looked around at the faces of her community, the people who had stood by her, who had helped her find her voice, who had reminded her that no farm or farmer ever truly stands alone. The future was still uncertain, but something had shifted. A door had opened, a possibility had taken root. As she accepted a plate of food and settled into her favorite chair, Beverly Davis smiled. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were all fighting together. And maybe that was the most important harvest of all. The week following Beverly's testimony passed in a whirlwind of activity. Her kitchen table, once a place of solitary morning coffees and worried calculations, had transformed into an impromptu command center. Laptops and tablets now sat alongside, the familiar coffee pot, as a new generation of farmers worked to bridge the gap between tradition and innovation. Tommy, her grandson, had taken the lead in modernizing the farm's operations. "Look at these numbers, Grandma," he said one morning, pointing to his computer screen. "The website's had over 10,000 visits since your testimony. People want to know where their food comes from. They want to connect with the farms that grow it." Beverly leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the charts and graphs that seemed to speak a language she was only beginning to learn. The website Tommy had created wasn't just a digital storefront. It was telling their story, connecting consumers directly with the land that fed them. "That's all very nice," she said, placing a fresh cup of coffee beside him. "But pretty pictures on a computer screen won't pay the bank." "Actually," a familiar voice interjected, "they might do exactly that." J.D. Vance stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, looking both tired and energized. Since the testimony, he'd been working tirelessly, shuttling between government offices, and financial institutions, building support for what he called the Family Farm Preservation Initiative. "The committee was impressed by your testimony, Mrs. Davis," he continued, accepting the cup of coffee Beverly offered. "But what's really gotten their attention is the response from the public. Your story has sparked something. People are starting to ask questions about where their food comes from, about the real cost of losing family farms." He spread several documents across the table. "The bank has agreed to halt the foreclosure proceedings, pending the implementation of our new cooperative model. But that's just the beginning." Over the next few hours, as more neighbors arrived, Vance outlined the plan that had emerged from the past week's negotiations. The Davis farm would serve as a pilot program for a new approach to small-scale agriculture, combining traditional farming wisdom with modern technology and marketing strategies. Chad Lamb leaned forward, studying the proposals. "So we'd all maintain ownership of our individual farms, but work together on purchasing, marketing, and distribution?" "Exactly," Vance nodded. "By pooling resources, you can achieve some of the economies of scale that make corporate farms profitable, while maintaining the flexibility and personal touch that make family farms special." Eric Carrillo, who had been quietly listening from his corner, spoke up. "My father always said the problem wasn't that small farms couldn't compete. It was that we were trying to compete on the wrong terms. Maybe this is our chance to change the game." The plan wasn't without its challenges. Implementation would require significant changes in how the farms operated. New equipment would need to be purchased, training programs developed, legal structures established. But for the first time, the path forward seemed clear. As the meeting continued, Beverly slipped outside onto her porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, and in the distance, she could hear the familiar rumble of tractors. Paul Hansen's boy was helping the widow Jennifer Bell with her late planting. Another example of the community bonds they were fighting to preserve. "Penny for your thoughts?" Lisa Wallace joined her on the porch, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. Beverly accepted one gratefully. "Just thinking about William. He always said farming was about adaptation. The land stays the same, he'd tell me, but how we work, it has to change with the times." He was right, Lisa nodded. "You know, when we lost our farm, I thought it was the end of everything. But watching what's happening here, maybe it's showing us all a new way forward." Inside, the discussion had turned technical. Tommy and some of the younger farmers were explaining the concept of digital inventory management to their elders, while Michael Washington sketched out plans for educational programs that would combine traditional agricultural knowledge with modern, sustainable farming practices. "The key," Vance was saying as Beverly returned inside, "is to understand that we're not just preserving farms. We're reinventing them for the 21st century." The transformation was already beginning. That morning, a film crew from a national news network had arrived to document what they were calling the Davis Farm Revolution. Beverly had watched with a mixture of amusement and pride as young reporters in city clothes interviewed weathered farmers about soil composition and sustainable agriculture practices. But the real breakthrough came later that afternoon when Thomas Pierce arrived from the bank. The man who had once been the bearer of such devastating news now carried a different kind of document, a proposal for restructuring the Davis Farm's debt as part of the new cooperative initiative. "Mrs. Davis," he began, his corporate polish showing hints of genuine respect, "our institution has reviewed the proposed changes to your operation, and we're prepared to not only halt the foreclosure proceedings, but to offer additional financing for the modernization efforts." Beverly studied the man's face, remembering their confrontation at the committee hearing. "What changed your mind, Mr. Pierce?" He glanced around the kitchen, taking in the mixture of old and new. Farmers in worn overalls working alongside young people with laptops, traditional wisdom meeting modern innovation. Let's just say you've made us reconsider what makes a farm viable in today's economy. As the sun set on another busy day, Beverly's kitchen slowly emptied. The last to leave was J.D. Vance, who paused at the door. "You know, Mrs. Davis, when I first read about your situation, I saw it as a chance to save one farm. Now I realize it's about much more than that. You've started something here that could change the face of American agriculture." Beverly watched him drive away, then turned back to her kitchen. Tommy was still there, updating the website with news of the day's developments. On his screen, she could see images of her farm, her neighbors, their story being shared with the world. A notification popped up, another order through the website's new direct-to-consumer program. Someone in a city hundreds of miles away had chosen to connect directly with their farm, to know exactly where their food was coming from and who was growing it. "You see, Grandma?" Tommy grinned. The old ways and the new ways, working together. That night, Beverly sat on her porch long after Tommy had gone home. The moon cast silver light across her fields, the same light that had shone down on this land for generations. But now, alongside the timeless rhythm of growth and harvest, there was something new growing, hope for a future that honored the past while embracing change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Mom, you're trending on social media. Save Family Farms is spreading across the country." Beverly chuckled, shaking her head at how much had changed in just a few weeks. From the brink of losing everything to becoming a symbol of rural America's resilience and adaptability. William would have loved the irony of it all. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying across fields that had been in danger of falling silent. But now those fields hummed with new possibility, a harmony of tradition and innovation that promised not just survival, but revival. Beverly Davis smiled, feeling the weight of uncertainty finally lifting from her shoulders. The farm that she and William had poured their lives into wouldn't be lost after all. Instead, it was becoming something new, a bridge between past and future, a seed from which a new kind of farming could grow. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges, more opportunities to blend the wisdom of generations with the possibilities of the present. But for tonight, Beverly was content to sit on her porch, listening to the ancient song of the land and the new melody of hope rising to meet it. 3 months after Beverly's testimony, the Davis farm had become unrecognizable, not in its physical appearance, which still maintained the timeless beauty of well-tended fields and carefully preserved buildings, but in its operation and significance. The farm that had once been on the brink of foreclosure was now a beacon of hope for family farmers across the nation. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Beverly stood at the edge of her cornfield, watching a drone hover above the crops. Tommy had explained how the device helped monitor crop health and optimize irrigation, but to Beverly, it still seemed like something from a science fiction novel. Yet here it was, working in harmony with the traditional farming methods she and William had used for decades. "Morning, Grandma," Tommy called out, tablet in hand as he approached. "The soil sensors are showing perfect moisture levels. That old irrigation system Dad helped Grandpa install back in '85? Turns out it was ahead of its time. We've just enhanced it with modern monitoring." Beverly nodded, remembering William's pride in that irrigation system. "Your grandfather always said good farming was about working with nature, not against it. Guess some things don't change, they just get upgraded." The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. A convoy of cars and buses was making its way down the gravel road toward the farm. Today marked the official launch of the family farm preservation initiative, and the Davis farm was hosting the inaugural event. "Ready for another performance?" J.D. Vance asked, walking up to join them. He had become a frequent visitor over the past months, watching as the pilot program took shape and helped navigate the inevitable challenges that arose. "This isn't a performance," Beverly replied, straightening her collar. "This is just showing people the truth about what family farms can be." The truth had become something of a movement. What started with one widow's fight to save her farm had sparked a national conversation about the future of agriculture in America. The Davis Farm Cooperative model, as it was now known, had been featured in national news, agricultural journals, and even international publications. As Beverly walked toward the gathering crowd, she saw familiar faces mixed with new ones. Chad Lamb and Eric Carrillo were setting up displays, showing how the cooperative system had transformed their operations. Lisa Wallace, who had once lost her own farm, was now coordinating the educational programs that brought young people back to farming. "Mrs. Davis," a young reporter approached, microphone in hand, "how does it feel to see your story inspiring changes across the country?" Beverly paused, looking out over her land. The morning sun illuminated both the traditional elements, the weathered barn, the familiar fields, and the new additions, solar panels on the barn roof, modern equipment shared among cooperative members, the teaching center where traditional farming wisdom was being passed on to a new generation. "This was never just my story," she replied. "It's the story of every family farmer who's ever struggled to preserve their way of life, while adapting to changing times. What you see here today is proof that we don't have to choose between tradition and progress. We can have both." The event was more than just a ceremony. It was a demonstration of what was possible when community, technology, and tradition worked together. In the renovated barn, now serving as a community hub, Michael Washington led workshops on sustainable farming practices. Tommy and his tech-savvy friends showed visitors how digital tools were revolutionizing small farm operations. Paul Hansen, whose agricultural supply store had been struggling, now managed the cooperative's shared equipment program. "Business is better than ever," he told a group of visiting farmers. "Turns out when small farms work together, we can all thrive." Even Thomas Pierce from the bank had become an unlikely ally. The Davis Farm model has changed how we evaluate agricultural loans, he explained to his colleagues. "We're looking at community impact, environmental sustainability, and long-term viability in ways we never considered before." The afternoon brought the most meaningful moment for Beverly. Sarah had organized a special presentation in the teaching center where photographs chronicling the farm's history covered the walls. There was William on their wedding day, standing proudly in front of the farmhouse. There they were with their children, teaching them the rhythms of farm life. And now, new photos showed Tommy and his generation bringing their own children to learn from the land. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "did you ever think when you got that foreclosure notice that it would lead to all this?" Beverly shook her head, remembering those dark days that now seemed so long ago. "Your father used to say that sometimes the hardest times plant the seeds for the richest harvests. I didn't understand what he meant until now." As the sun began to set, the visitors gathered in the field behind the house for the final event of the day. J.D. Vance stood at a podium, the golden light catching the pride in his expression. "What we're witnessing here isn't just the salvation of one farm," he announced. "It's the blueprint for preserving America's agricultural heritage while embracing its future. The Davis Farm has shown us that family farms aren't relics of the past. They're innovators of the future." He turned to Beverly, holding up a document. "Which is why I'm proud to announce that the Family Farm Preservation Initiative has secured federal funding to expand this program nationwide. Mrs. Davis, your fight to save your farm is going to help save hundreds more." The applause was thunderous, but Beverly hardly heard it. Her eyes were drawn to the fields beyond the crowd, where the evening light painted the crops in shades of gold and promise. She thought of William, of all the years they'd worked this land together, of his unwavering belief that farming was about more than just growing crops. It was about growing community, growing wisdom, growing hope. Later that night, after the crowds had gone and the excitement had quieted, Beverly sat on her porch swing, as she had done thousands of times before. Tommy joined her, his tablet set aside for once. "You know what's amazing, Grandma?" he said softly. "When this all started, we thought we were fighting to save the past. Turns out we were actually building the future." Beverly reached out and squeezed his hand, this grandson who had helped bridge the gap between her world and the new one rushing in. "The best futures," she said, "are built on foundations laid by those who came before us. Your grandfather understood that. Now it's our job to make sure those foundations stay strong while we build something new on top of them." Above them, stars twinkled in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided farmers for generations. But now they shared the heavens with satellites that helped monitor crops and weather patterns. It was a perfect metaphor, Beverly thought, for what they'd achieved, finding ways for the old and the new to coexist and complement each other. The Davis farm had been saved, but it had become something more than just a family farm. It was now a symbol of hope, a model for change, and a bridge between generations. The deed J.D. Vance had brought that first day hadn't just secured the land, it had helped secure the future of family farming itself. As Beverly closed her eyes and listened to the familiar nighttime sounds of her farm, she smiled. The fight wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new changes to adapt to, new battles to fight. But now they faced those challenges together, armed with both the wisdom of the past and the tools of the future. "Well, William," she whispered to the night air, "we did it. We saved our farm. And maybe, just maybe, we helped save a whole way of life along with it." The soft evening breeze carried the scent of earth and growing things, of promise and possibility, of endings that became beginnings. The Davis farm lived on, not just as a piece of land, but as a testament to the power of community, the importance of adaptation, and the enduring strength of the American family farm.